one of the most dangerous spots in the world is seen to be Taiwan. And so Taiwan is clearly going to be affected by this because you're going to be a pawn in this contest. If Taiwan pushes for independence, Taiwan is going to become more and more isolated globally. I guarantee you this. The majority of countries will not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. This is a geopolitical reality.
In the high-stakes rivalry between China and the U.S., Taiwan has become one of the biggest flashpoints in global politics. But why is this tiny island at the center of so much tension? In this eye-opening talk, Professor Kishore Mahbubani breaks down why the Taiwan issue is so critical and what the people of Taiwan should do in these uncertain times. You won't want to miss this.
I'm very glad to be back in Taipei again at a very interesting moment in history, because what's significant about our times is that we're probably going to experience greater change in the next 10, 20 years than we have in a long time in human history. Major changes are coming. What I hope to do today is to share with you my view on what these changes are, and also talk about the implications for Taiwan. And I must emphasize that I'm trying to speak to the people of Taiwan as a friend of Taiwan, because as you look around the world and you ask yourself which parts of the world can possibly suffer a great deal as a result of these changes, it's clear that there are some dangerous flashpoints in the world and some less dangerous, or frankly even relatively peaceful areas of the world. And if you had to do a list of some of the most dangerous areas in the world, by any objective calculation, Taiwan comes very high up on the list. So that's why it's very important for the people of Taiwan to understand clearly what is happening, especially in the field of geopolitics. And that's why I believe you call it the Geopolitical Summit. So let me begin in part one by talking about the larger structural changes. And it's important to emphasize here that these structural changes are phenomenal. I'll just give you one example, right? For the past 200 years, in one way or another, world history has been dominated by the West. Clearly. In fact, 100 years ago, every corner of the world was all colonized by Western powers. My ancestors come from India. In the year 1924, 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians. Isn't that stunning? Isn't that amazing? That was the world. That was the West. So Western power has continued for a very long time. But we are now clearly reaching the end of the era of Western domination of world history. But I hasten to add that the end of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. The West will still remain the single strongest civilization, still have an impact on the world, but its ability to dominate the world is disappearing. And I just to give you one concrete example. As you all know, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which as you all know, clearly was illegal under international law, many countries, in fact a majority of countries in the world, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in response to the invasion, the West imposed sanctions on Ukraine, thinking, hey, this is the right thing to do, and the international community will of course support the West in imposing sanctions on Ukraine. That would have been a natural thing that the West expected. But instead, 85% of the world's population did not follow the West in imposing sanctions on Russia. 85% of the world did not follow the West. So paradoxically, what the West thought was a move that would end up isolating Russia ended up actually in a move that showed the relative isolation of the West from the rest. And the waking up of what I call the global South, who by the way represent 88% of the world's population. The West only represents 12%. The 88% which were dormant for a long time have woken up. And so the texture, the chemistry of the world is changing as a result. And if you want to understand the scale of these changes, maybe let me compare it to something that you all understand. You all know that climate change is having a dramatic effect on our world, right? We're seeing all kinds of new weather phenomena emerge, droughts, hurricanes, typhoons, remarkable changes in the world. But that's what's happening in the physical sphere. But in the geopolitical sphere, we are also experiencing geopolitical climate change. Structural changes are taking place, and if structural changes are taking place, the most dangerous thing you could do is to go blind, sail blind, and pretend that the world isn't changing. And so for the people of Taiwan, when there's so many geopolitical shifts happening, you have to try and understand what they are and how they will impact you. Because as I started by saying, one of the most dangerous spots in the world is seen to be Taiwan. And to understand why, let me now go to part 2 of my remarks and talk about the biggest geopolitical contest, which is always the one within the world's number one power, which today is United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China. And it is, I think everyone knows that a major geopolitical contest has broken out between U.S. and China, and there's no question that it will accelerate over the next 10 years. And so Taiwan is clearly going to be affected by this, because you're going to be a pawn in this contest. Pawns often get sacrificed, so it's important for pawns to be geopolitically adept and make sure they don't get into the line of fire. But of course, one thing that you need to do is to also understand what are the structural forces driving this contest. And I highlight 3 of them. One is, of course, what I call the iron law of geopolitics. Whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is the United States, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. This is like an iron law of geopolitics. But this is also something that is well known. I think, as CY may have mentioned, Graham Allison has been here. He's written a book, Destined for War, in which he's done case study after case study of such power transitions. And most of the time, it leads, in his view, to contestation and often to wars. So what is therefore happening between US and China is predictable. It's not surprising, right? This is normal. What should be the wisest thing for Taiwan to do? I think it's extremely important for Taiwan to be aware that at a time, at such a dangerous time like this, you've got to be very careful with what you do. I know that there are people in Taiwan who believe that what will be good for Taiwan is independence of some kind. That would be dangerous under any circumstances, but it would be especially dangerous at a moment like this. Because if you walk into a room full of gas and you light a spark, you get a major explosion. So people who are pushing for independence have to understand the dangers. And there's also one paradox here. The goal of pushing for independence is to have greater freedom of action, to be able to do more things that you think you can do if you're independent. Effectively, though, if Taiwan pushes for independence, Taiwan is going to become more and more isolated globally. Because right now, one of the great benefits of being a Taiwanese is that you have a passport that is recognized and accepted 150, 160 countries around the world. But just imagine, if you push for independence, you force countries to decide, do I want to recognize Taiwan as independent? I guarantee you this, the majority of countries will not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. This is a geopolitical reality. So what you do, therefore, in pushing for independence is to lock yourself up into a small jail and throw the key away. Now, this may be a beautiful island to live in, but your capacity to travel and to engage the world will be diminished, especially now, because it's such a dangerous moment in history. I also know there are people here who believe that perhaps you could go to the UN and get some support in some way or another. Having been an ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I can tell you that UN ambassadors are incredibly astute in their understanding of global geopolitics. They know what needs to be done. And they also know, many of them, if you force them to make a choice between China and Taiwan, there is no choice for them. Their ties with China have gone up by leaps and bounds, right? Take trade between China and Southeast Asia. In the year 2000, trade between U.S., China and ASEAN was only $40 billion in 2000. By 2022, it had become $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. Southeast Asian countries cannot sacrifice $1 trillion in trade. A country like Brazil, that's far away. It took Brazil 20 years ago, 1 year, to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. And you're asking the Brazilians, choose. So therefore, it's very important if the people of Taiwan want to preserve the peace that they have had, you must understand what a complex, difficult geopolitical environment is arriving your way. Please be extremely alert. Please be extremely careful, because if you're not, the consequences can be very painful. Thank you.